In this lecture, we will understand more about DTOs and domain models. Before we proceed ahead with any other action methods, it's now time to understand what DTOs are and how they differ from domain models. DTOs, or data transfer objects, are objects that are used to transfer data between different layers of components of an application. They are simple objects that typically contain a subset of the properties of a domain object or entity, and are designed to be used for a specific purpose, such as transferring data over the network or between layers of an application. As we see in this example, we have our API over here. We have the database which talks to the API, and we also have the client which is calling this API to get some data or to add some data. Now at the moment we have domain models over here. And for us, because we are using Entity Framework Core, domain models have a mapping between the tables in the database and the domain models that are used internally in the application. When you use Entity Framework to talk to a table, it gives us the domain model because the DB context class only knows about the domain models. But because we have the domain models within the API, it is a good practice to add a layer of DTOs, that is the data transfer objects, and that is what we send back to the client. So we never send the domain model back to the client, but we send the DTO instead. So once the DB context class is able to provide us with the list of domain model or the information about the domain model, we then do a mapping between the domain model and the DTO so that we can send the DTO back to the client. If it is information coming from the client, for example, if the client wants to add a new resource, then we receive a DTO, which then we convert from DTO to domain model, and then we send the domain model using Entity Framework Core to the database. So that's how DTOs are used in the application, and that's how they differ from domain models. Now you would be asking, what are the benefits of using DTOs if they are exactly the same as domain models? Now the first thing is, domain models can have slightly more properties and slightly different named properties which we don't want to expose to our client. So there are actually advantages of having DTOs, because when we can manipulate our properties inside the DTOs that we want to send back to the client. For example, the advantages of DTOs are the separation of concern. So DTOs help us to separate the concerns of an application. The domain objects are usually tightly coupled with a database schema, as we just know, because Entity Framework Core uses them to talk to a database, whereas DTOs can be designed to match the business requirements. This separation ensures that the domain objects are not tightly coupled with the API or the view layer. The second advantage is performance. Using DTOs, you can help to improve the performance of an application. This is because they allow us to retrieve only the data that is needed. For example, in our application, if we don't want to send the whole region information back, we can just send in the name of the region back if that is the requirement, and we don't have to send other properties of that region domain model back to the client. So then in that case, we just use a DTO and only one property in that DTO. Then we map all the information from the domain model to the DTO that we can send back to the client. It also improves on security because DTOs can help us to improve security by limiting the amount of data that is exposed to the client. By only exposing the necessary data, you can reduce the risk of exposing sensitive data to unauthorized users. And at last, it also helps us to improve versioning because it can be versioned independently, allowing you to update the API without breaking the existing clients. If you were to make a change to a domain model which was exposed to the client, it wasn't possible because then the client wouldn't be able to send the information again because you now have breaking changes. But now we can change the domain model but can keep the DTO the same, so that we are not breaking the contract between the client and the API, but we can still play around with the domain models within our application.